Welcome back to Ancient Wales, Episode 8, Crafting Iron Age Lives. Now, we've talked in depth throughout this podcast as we've done these monthly episodes about various different things. We've talked about warfare, we've talked about shelter, we've talked about developments in iron from Bronze Age casting to Iron Age casting to the advancement of various mythologies and religious movements. And we've talked a bit about the art of the area and the local tribes as far as we understand them to be, typically from the late Iron Age, because before that we really don't know enough to be able to say these were definitely tribes that existed or not, and where they might have come from or where they were at the time. So, with all that said and done, we're going to delve a lot more now into some of the textile work that was done in the Iron Age, which kind of defines a lot of what we know about the Iron Age world, much like a lot of our understandings of pre-modern society. For some obvious reasons, pottery is something that we find pretty consistently throughout the centuries of existence of humanity. Part of this is because it's one of the first things we make outside of tools. It is one of the easiest things for us to create using fire. And it is very significantly important because of its ability to carry and contain things like liquids and food and all sorts of different things. And it's used in so many diverse ways and for so many diverse reasons that it becomes ubiquitous in the lifestyle of every human throughout history, both pre and post written history. And so much so that we still today use it quite consistently. Everything from a bowl that we'll use to a cup, sometimes to mugs and that kind of thing. You know, we're still using a version of pottery that was passed down to us from our earliest ancestors, from the earliest ages of the Neolithic period, where all of this stuff really does begin to be used in much more detail, partially because of its durability, partially because of its ability to handle heat. Makes pottery very important to the lifestyle of the Iron Age Britons. If you think about it, prior to this, it was probably likely that wood was used for bowls or plates or that style of implement. So it's good to understand that as the basis of how that might have began, because of course you could make things out of stone, but that's heavy, it's hard to carry around. You're not going to have the same reusability. And another side effect to a lot of malleable stone is that it will chip easily. It will break easily. It can have, bits coming off when you're making stuff. You don't want that, obviously, in your place where you're eating. And you can see this kind of thing if you look at the Middle Ages, where stone is used a lot in grinding and in milling, and quite frequently you hear about stones and bits of stones being baked literally into bread and food so that it could have a adverse effect on teeth. So having something that can contain all this stuff that doesn't necessarily cause problems with leaking things into it, it's harder for it to leak, bluntly. And as well, you also see that it creates a situation where it allows everybody to have something that they can use. It's generally relatively light. You can pack it because you can stack them if you have them in a certain format, or you can, make them into a use that makes the most sense, right? All of these things are the reason why we start to use pottery, and that's why it makes such a massive difference to the life of Iron Age Britons. So, with all that said, let's begin with one of the most hands-on and important parts of pottery making. Unlike today's highly mechanized process, Iron Age pottery in Britain was a slow, deliberate, and communal activity. Pottery was handmade, obviously, as there was no potter's wheels, unlike at the very end of the Iron Age, and even then, they were rare and likely influenced by continental styles, as obviously most things would be. Trade and relationships with various peoples would show the quality of different things. You look at Roman Samian ware, and you compare it to the Iron Age pottery, it's not even close. So quality, design, all of those things start to become important, and thus you start to see them being migrated into the usage of Iron Age peoples. So, how did Iron Age potters create these durable and functional vessels? It all started with clay sourcing. People collected clay from various local riverbanks or clay rich soils, but raw clay couldn't be used as is. It needed to be tempered, a process where materials like crushed shells, grog, which is ground up old pottery, sand, and even straw was mixed into it to give it various qualities. And as an example, a pot tempered with shell might contain heat better, making it ideal for cooking as opposed to maybe holding water. Once tempered, the clay was then kneaded, much like bread dough, to remove air pockets. Then came the construction phase. The most common techniques were coiling, where the potter would then roll the clay into long ropes and then coil them upward in a spiral, smoothing them as they went to build the pot's wall. Slab building, where flat pieces of clay were joined, were also used for larger vessels, as you could understand and see. It would take a long time to do the other methods, so having that aspect would make sense. Now let's talk firing, which might be the most prepared and important step in the process. If you've ever done pottery in school and you've done firing, you've seen what can go wrong, probably, when it's done incorrectly, when you fired too early, too long. There's all sorts of things, and they'll crack, or they won't be as able to handle, anything beyond a little bit of wear. All of that is something that becomes very obvious when we use our modern techniques. As you can imagine, that would create issues and be problematic. Now, let's talk about that firing, which might be the most precarious step. Iron Age Britons didn't use kilns in the way we think of them today. Instead, pottery was fired in bonfires or shallow pits. Pots were then stacked with kindling and dung and covered with turf to control the airflow. It was a low-tech but highly skilled process, and as you can imagine, that's likely why you would have skilled potterers who would be the ones who would do all this. It wouldn't just be somebody who decided to make it on their own, typically, because even in this era, there are specialized professions, and certainly that would be one of them. And you can imagine they'd be very valuable to the community because of how much pottery is used and needed. Having someone who has the skills and ability to be able to do this is an incredibly important aspect of daily life. While all this is being done, temperatures could reach as high as around 600 to 800 degrees Celsius, and oxygen levels determined the final color of the pottery. A smoky, oxygen poor fire might result in a blackened ware, while an open, oxygen-rich fire could produce red or orange tones. And of course, all of that comes down to the skill of the person making it and what is the desire and what is the cultural impact of various things in this area. Interestingly, archaeologist Dr. Joanna Brooke, who is a leading specialist in British prehistory, argues that pottery making was not just functional, it had a social and symbolic significance. It was often done by women with a skilled passed down through the generations. The communal nature of the craft, done within households or small communities, meant that every pot carried a fingerprint of its people. And you can imagine if you had a pot that lasted a long time, let's say it's a pot that maybe your grandmother made, you could see how that would then become significant in a different way and would hold a special significance in the family or in the community in a way that would make it worth having. Now, and it creates a value of its own, even if it might not look like the best thing ever. Like when we look at pottery from this age, there's a lot of talk about it's very ugly or it's very rudimentary. Well, of course it is, because it's different time and a different process and a different ability. And so it's much simpler, but it doesn't make it any less significant to the people who are using it. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that from a cultural standpoint, it is an important piece to them. And it's something that everybody has. It's not like, a sword, which maybe only the warrior class or the leaders have. It's not like a gold torque, which largely probably only the wealthiest member of society or the leader of the society actually owns. These are people's everyday everything. So you can imagine how significant it would be to them on a day-to-day basis. Evidence from sites such as the Danbury Hill Fort in Hampshire, excavated by Barry Cunliffe, show workshops where tools and broken wasters or failed pots showed that the production was frequent, local, and varied by region. One final note: the very act of firing a pottery may have been ceremonial. Some ethnographic parallels suggest that these firings weren't just utilitarian, but social events filled with song, storytelling, and ritual, linking the clay to the community and to the land. And I could very much see that as being the case in Iron Age Britain because of, as I said, if you think about the significance, especially of older pottery that might have made it through a long time, it would become very ritualistically important. So the firing of pottery could be significant as well. From a mythological standpoint, maybe the firing of pottery was seen as being a way of capturing spirits or taming fire or making some sort of symbolic gesture to a mythological deity. Again, this is throwing out guesses, but I think there is some obvious reason why this would be happening, and you can see how it becomes important in that respect, especially because so frequently pottery is being used in burials and in, ceremonies that are ritualistic by their very nature. So when you look at Iron Age pots in a museum, you have to consider and look to how they were made and think about who made them and how it affected the daily life of people just like you, because realistically, they were just like you. Pottery in the Iron Age wasn't just for show, it was an integral part of daily life, as we said. Large storage jars generally held grains and liquids, while smaller pots were used for cooking, serving food, and some vessels, like the finely made red slipwares, mimicked the appearance of bronze and were likely used in special occasions or on display status, very similar to the idea of fine china in the modern parlance. Interestingly, certain pots have been found in deliberate places upside down in pits within roundhouses, suggesting that they played a role in the ritual or symbolic acts, perhaps marking the closing of a dwelling. Pottery styles varied from across Britain, reflecting the regional identities and external influences. In the early Iron Age, pottery was often plain, but as time progressed, decoration became more common. Scoreware, characterized by incision lines or patterns, emerged in the Middle Iron Age, possibly to aid grip or as an aesthetic. We've already explored how Iron Age pottery is crafted and used, but now how did it look? Despite being handmade and utilitarian, Iron Age pottery in Britain was far from plain. In fact, the decorations, or deliberate lack thereof, tell us as much about the regional identity and social meaning and cross-cultural contact as any burial mound or hill fort. So, let's have a better look at what that would have looked like. During the early Iron Age, between 800 to 400 BCE, British pottery was often plain, but not because people lacked the creativity. The focus was on function, and decoration, if present, was subtle. Vessels might feature incision lines, fingernail impressions, or cordons, raised strips of clay added to the grip or an accent. These decorations were usually concentrated near the rim or the shoulder of the pot, perhaps where they were most visible in use and possibly for functionality's sake. By the Middle Iron Age, between 400 and 100 BCE, pottery saw more experimentation. This period introduced what archaeologists call scored ware, something we've just mentioned, which was particular in southern Britain. These were pots, of course, as I mentioned earlier, that had rough lines on them, and others, however, were smoothed and burnished, giving them a polished, almost metallic sheen. Burnishing wasn't just pretty, it helped reduce porosity, or in other words, leakage. Decorative motifs tend to be geometric and restrained, parallel lines, chevrons, and concentric circles. There's little in the way of pictorial or narrative decorations in British Iron Age pottery, unlike the Mediterranean world, and it makes it stand out in part because of that. And this is common throughout most of the British styling, it's not just that they don't use figurines, or even when they do, it's much different than it is in the Mediterranean world. And the idea of stylizing a body didn't really bother them the way it did, it seemingly in like the Greek world, especially where you see pottery coming out, which has very obviously proportioned people, which is very different than what we see here. Moving into the late Iron Age, between 100 BCE and 43 CE, pottery decoration became increasingly influenced by the continental styles, as you could imagine. This is a period, of course, where Julius Caesar's invasion takes place, where a lot of trade is being done across the English Channel, and we're starting to see the influences of Roman Mediterranean styling starting to enter here, particularly those associated with the Belgae and other migrating trading groups started to affect southeast Britain, where we find wheel-made grog-tempered Belgic ware, often with sharp incisions and combed decorations in bands around the vessel. These often mimicked metal forms, perhaps indicating status or aspirations, middle class basically. At elite sites, some pottery even takes on a pseudo-metal aesthetic, with red slipped furnishes or lugs shaped like rivets, invoking bronze vessels. According to archaeologist Dr. Melanie Giles, these were not just functional objects, but a way to perform identity and status. Now, how does this compare with the rest of Western Europe? Because, of course, it is changing at the same time. In Gaul, modern France and Belgium, these areas, which were controlled by the Latène culture, pottery decorations were often more elaborate. Latène style was renowned for its flowing curvilinear motifs and spiral triskelies and vegetal forms. So, in other words, what we've talked about in the past, in Britain even, which sometimes applied to ceramics, but more often was seen in metalwork. Still, some of this pottery included stylized faces or animal motifs in low relief. Pottery in Celtic Central Europe, such as Hudenberg and Alpida regions, tended to be more finely finished and in some cases featured graphite burnishings, such as metal black sheen. This, of course, is rarely found in the British examples that we've discussed. In Iberia, particularly in the Celtiberian regions, painted pottery was more common and often with geometric designs in red or black over buff clay. This contrasts with Britain, where painted pottery was virtually unknown until the Roman influence. Even in northern Italy, pottery was more influenced by Etruscan or Greek aesthetic, showing a different set of values, which were, of course, more pictorial and more associated with trade or formal dining. In short, British pottery was generally more tactile, textured, and geometric. Continental Europe saw more flowing, organic motifs, and Southern Europe and Iberia produced more paint and polychromatic techniques, which never caught on in Iron Age Britain, likely because it was such a fancy styling. It probably just never reached there, or if it did, it was more like a sample, to put it bluntly. And likely those pottery makers were probably trying to protect themselves from having their ideas and their technology stolen. The relative simplicity of British decoration may reflect practical constraints like open firing and coarse clay, but also cultural values. In Britain, pottery wasn't just about appearance, it was embedded into daily life and ritual, sometimes deliberately broken, buried, or burned. Decoration was not necessarily to impress, but to mark identities, regions, or communities. Iron Age pottery in Britain spanned approximately 800 years, and of course exhibits a range of techniques evolving over time and over the various regions. We've mentioned all of the styling and the design styles, but I just wanted to bring up a few specifics, especially in the late Iron Age, which talks more about location. Influences from continental Europe, of course, become more pronounced, which starts to affect the southeast part of Britain, which is more directly connected. But we do see things like the Aylesford swarling pottery, which introduced wheel-thrown techniques, including cordons and corrugations, and zones of combed or furrowed decorations. The Gallo-Belgic imports, which included black slipped and red slipped wares, often were stamped or in a roulette design. These styles signified an increase in trade and the cultural exchange that was happening between continental Europe and especially southeast Britain. As mentioned in the late Iron Age, we saw the introduction of Belgic pottery, which brought over Belgic people from continental Europe, or at least that's the idea. These vessels were often grog-tempered and featured distinct shapes and decorations, indicating a blend of local or foreign ceramic traditions. When we imagine the Iron Age, it's easy to picture sturdy hill forts and coarse pottery. But what about the clothing that people wore? This is something we haven't really delved into. What did a weaver's world look like over 2,000 years ago? And that in itself is very fascinating. And there is some interesting research that goes into this. Textiles in Iron Age Britain often are an elusive subject, as you can imagine. Unlike pottery, where shards of pottery are found all the time in any sort of area where Iron Age people lived and worked or did anything, you're going to find pottery. Not necessarily with textiles, which often damage quite quickly. And in fact, most of what we have been found in bogs or waterlogged pits because they cut out oxygen, which then allows these to survive in a way they wouldn't have otherwise. And so we do get an understanding about what they lived and worked with in and how that affected how they did and achieved certain things. So even with all of this enduring, it's still just a nebulous amount by comparison to probably what there was, obviously, because every single person would have needed textiles, clothing, to give it its better description. And so there should, you would think, be tons of it somewhere, but of course it's all degraded and disappeared for the most part. So with all that said and done, let's start with the raw materials. The primary fiber, of course, was wool, which was harvested from domesticated sheep. These sheep were not unlike modern breeds that we see today, but there were some that could be a little different. According to the research of Margarita Gabella, a specialist in prehistoric textiles at the University of Cambridge, iron wool was coarser and varied in color, while from whites to gray and natural browns and black. Spinning was typically done using drop spindles, small tools with a whorl that helped twist the wool into yarn. Evidence of these tools, often beautifully decorated, were found in settlements like Glastonbury Lake Village and the hill forts at Maiden Castle. These spindle whorls suggested that spinning was not just widespread, but possibly personalized and even symbolic. The weaving process came next. Weavers used upright, warp-weighted looms, which leaned against the wall using stone or clay weights to keep threads taut. The vertical loom allowed the weavers to create large pieces of cloth effectively and with a surprising level of control over the pattern and texture. A remarkable discovery from the site at Hallstatt in Austria, for example, which shares cultural similarities with Iron Age Britain, included fragments of twill weave, a diagonal pattern which is still used in denim today. This technique were likely used across Britain, showing Iron Age weavers understood complex structures and weaves. What about dyeing? Textiles weren't just functional, of course, they were expressive. Iron Age Britons used natural dyes from plants like woad for blues, madder root for reds and oranges, and weld for yellows. According to textile archaeologist Dr. Elizabeth Wayland Barber, who was speaking about prehistoric clothing, she pointed out that these colors weren't just for aesthetics and that they could signal identity, tribal affiliation, or social status. The brighter and more vivid the dye, the more prestige it likely carried for the wearer, which you can totally understand, especially colors that may be harder to gain and get, and the work done to get them being more important. It's the reason why gold becomes so important, especially in the Middle East during this time period, and you see it used in temples and a lot of places where ritual and important figures are being there. And even though it's, useless for a lot of things, it becomes very valuable because of the shine and the way it looks. And that makes perfect sense. And so if a textile is very bright and vivid, it would certainly give a sense of importance to someone. And I think one thing we have to cure ourselves of as modern people is remove from our ideas the concept that things are ugly, brown, and just that way about everything in any age that isn't our modern one. Color usage was important and it was used everywhere. The idea that when we walk into a Roman site and we see marble everywhere, that people are like, oh, well, it just all looked very white and shiny and clean. Well, that's not the way it looked. Typically in Roman times, typically things were painted. Walls were painted. We see this quite commonly, actually, if you go into Pompeii, for example. Murals and paintings were everywhere. And just like today, people want to have decoration that are symbolic to them. So you can understand how they wouldn't just be living in a drab environment. No one wants to live in a depressing looking, muddy, dirty, ugly area. No one wants to dress like that all the time either. There is clothing that we wear for the ease of the wearing, but at the same time, nobody just wears the same dark brown, black hoodie every day necessarily. You would hope. And nobody wears the same pair of pants or trousers. Nobody wears the same hat or whatever or footwear every single day necessarily. So you can understand that in the Iron Age, people were probably very similar. They probably had their favorite clothing that they wore, their lucky clothing or their ritual clothing, or their Sunday best, if you want to call it that. Everybody would have their own versions of these things. Would there be tons of it? No. And would it be dependent on your income or your status? Yes. And this is why in the Roman world, purple becomes such an important color, because it's so hard to get. It becomes a symbol status of somebody important. And so wearing the purple becomes a symbol of literal rule, which I think that's something we have to understand, is that color does define who we are as people. So this is why in some respects you see this happening, and you see people wearing all these fancier colors, even though we think of them as only wearing these white or brown or black or dark clothing. That's not the reality that most people probably lived with or wanted to live with. And so, yeah, there was effort made to make things look nice. And we can see that in the pottery they had, in the types of pins and brooches they used, in the tunics that were pinned to them, in the shoes that were, made for them. And all of these things have to be understood. Clothing styles were not just practical, but they weren't plain. Men and women likely wore tunic-style garments with cloaks fastened with brooches and pins, and these garments were sometimes fringed with or pleated for style and flexibility. Footwear was often made from hide or leather and fastened with thongs. Interestingly, Iron Age people may have used felt and possibly linen, though the evidence for flax cultivation is far rarer than wool. Where available, linen was likely reserved for the finer ceremonial garments. As you can probably imagine, rarity probably bespoke the idea that it was used by upper classes or in specific cases. Jewelry and accessories, such as a fibli, which is a brooch, or a torque, a neck ring, and belt fittings completed the look and were often made from bronze and iron, in elite cases, gold. All of this would help to give even more color and vividness to an outfit. Just like today, and again, I go back to this. We have to understand that just because people lived in a different lifestyle didn't mean that people didn't appreciate the same sort of ideas that we did. It's just different. Recent experimental archaeology, like that conducted by the British Museum's Textile in Time program, showed that a single cloak could take weeks or even months to produce, from shearing the sheep to weaving the final fabric. This gives us a sense of the immense labor invested in what we might dismiss as just clothing. And textiles, of course, are among the most human of archaeological remains. because they tell us about gender, economy, trade, and identity in the most personal way possible. What you wear does define, in some respects, an identity of who you are. And your ability to personalize it becomes important to you because it gives a sense that I am not the same as the person standing next to me. I am my own person. And that is as important in the Iron Age as it is today. And I think that's something we always, always need to reflect back on. So while only the threads remain, they talk about the stories and the function and the fashion and the deep connection between the Iron Age Britons and the animals in their landscape, because, of course, all of these animals were important to those textile production. And of course, at the end of the day, it defines the landscape they're living in. And with all that said and done, I'd like to thank you for listening and for viewing today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at thewelshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. If you would like to help the podcast out in some respect or fashion, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh history. And if you have interest and are watching these videos on YouTube, if you could give this video a like or follow or subscribe to the channel, that would be awesome. It sure helps me out to know that people are liking these episodes. And importantly, if you have any other ways that you want to reach out to me, you can always reach out to me on various social media, from Instagram to Blue Sky to X, at the Welsh History Pod. And of course, if you want another way to contact me, you can always contact me via Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh history. I do try and respond to those who do ask questions as quickly as I can, sometimes not as quick as others, but otherwise I do try. And with all that said and done, thank you everyone for again, and hopefully you're having a great week. See you later. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.